We're making some Versailles planters in the workshop this week, but first here's a little bit of history. So it's 17th century France, and King Louis XIV has just moved his household, his royal retinue, to his palace at Versailles, where the cleaner air and cooler climate makes everybody happy. Everybody except for old Louis. Now, old Louis is fretting about his fruit trees. He's partial to a bit of citrus, and his orangery in particular haven't adapted well to the cooler climate. So what does a self-respecting king do? Well, he calls in his head gardener and says, sort this out. Now the head gardener, old one André Le Notre, puts down his glass of red wine for long enough to give a sort of fatalistic French shrug and says, let's put them in a big wooden box and take them indoors. A stroke of genius that saves the day, makes for a happy king, and quite possibly keeps André's head on his shoulders for that little bit longer. Now, this being 17th century France, there's no such thing as a plain wooden box. These boxes are quite fancy, quite distinctive, and that combined with the royal seal of approval makes these Versailles planters extremely popular, and they remain the top people's planter of choice to this day. Take a walk through any swanky hotel or upscale neighbourhood, you'll find a pair of these planters standing sentry duty either side of the expensive entranceways. Fortunately for the rest of us, we can make a modern take on these planters quickly, easily and cheaply. Let's turn ourselves around and find out how. Now, the construction of these planters is very straightforward. It's very simple, doesn't use any fancy tools or machinery. If you have a look in the show, the description of the show notes, there's a link there to just a single sheet which gives you a layout of the size that I'm making these to. And if you make them to that size, you can make them any size you want, but if you make them to that size, you'll need a half a sheet of 12mm exterior grade plywood. You need about 6 meters of 2x2 plain redwood, about 19 feet. You need 4 lengths of, this is 12x12mm half-inch square strip wood. I bought that. You can make that easily if you've got a table saw. You'll need some little balls for ornamentation. I just picked these up off eBay. They bounce really badly. And you'll need a few other bits and pieces as well. Some dowel screws, which we'll come to later on. Structurally, these planters are very straightforward. A pair of grooved plywood panels with a top and bottom rail and posts at either side are joined together by further panels and a base to make a cube. I've had my timber yard rip me a length of 12mm WBP exterior grade plywood to the correct width, and I'm cutting this to size to make the panels and the base. So with our 4 plywood panels cut, we're going to be using a V grooving bit to put a groove in each of the panels just to make it look more sort of panel-like. Now, it's worth remembering that this groove is purely decorative. You could do this with a track saw, you could do it with a tiny, not a rebate plane, a plough plane if you've got one of those. To be honest, you could probably do it with if you've got the time and patience, you'd probably do it with a Stanley knife and a metal ruler. I've got a V-grooving bit, so that's what I'll use in my router. And because there's a dozen or so of these cuts to make in each planter, I've made a little jig to make this easily repeatable. Now, the jig is just an MDF base with an offcut from the panel plywood screwed to the top as a top fence, and it's got a mark at the centre. I've marked up on one of the panels the centre and where I want the other grooves to go, and I've put stops in place for the left and right cuts. The router base runs between a couple of strips of 6mm MDF fixed to the top fence and to the base crossbar that's at just the right height for our panel. In use, you put the panel snugly against the top fence at the centre, clamp the base rail down and make your first cut. Release the rail and move the panel first to one side, then the other, making the cut each time. So with our grooved panels all done, and there's only one thing I want to do before we take those to the next stage, and that's just to talk about marking out the height of the posts. These are going to have a rail top and bottom, and the rails will join into the 4 corner posts. And there's no great sort of, set in stone thing here. I just want the posts to be a little bit off the ground, a little bit off the deck. So I'm just going to use a 3/4 inch bit of scrap. There, 18mm. Then we've got our bottom rail, which is going to go in there. Then we've got our panel in there. Then we've got our top rail in there. And then I'm going to use a slightly thicker piece at the very top, 25mm. The reason for that will become clear later. And we just mark that up. So now we know how long our posts need to be, which as it happens is just about bang on 570mm. So we need 4 of those, and we'll need 2, 4, 6, 8 top and 8 pieces for the top and bottom rail, the same width as the panels. But before we get to that, I just want to do something else with these panels. Okay, so the way we're joining the panels to the posts is we use our little bits of 12mm 1/2 inch beading. We're going to glue and pin this to the back and then fix those through to the posts. Now, the temptation when you're cutting these is almost always, and I know this because I've done it, you get 2 longer ones and 2 shorter ones that sort of sit between them. And then you've got to remember which are the long ones and which are the short ones and get them all sort of so that they're fitted right, and you've got to get the right amount of each one. It's actually much, much easier if you just stagger them slightly so that one comes up to here and that one goes down to here and that one goes across to there, and then suddenly you can cut them all to the same length and they're all exactly the same. It doesn't matter which ones go where. Makes life easier. I'm all for that. With the beading cut to length, it's a simple but slightly tedious matter to glue and pin these in place. And while the glue is setting, I can cut the corner posts and, carefully, as the glue isn't dry yet, use one of the panels to gauge the length of the top and bottom rails and cut these to size as well. On the tops of each post, I'm joining the diagonals and using an awl to mark the centre on each. And while we have the posts to hand, I'm brushing some wood hardener onto the base of each to help preserve the timber. So we've got our panels all glued up nice and tight, they're all good and dry and all nicely together. And we've got our rails, top and bottom rails all cut, ready to go. So we're just going to nail these together basically. Now what I don't want to do is have this big sort of gap at the front end. Can you see that? If I do it this way. If we align the back of the beading against the back of the rail, you get this big ugly gap here which is no good at all. So what I want to do is use a couple of little bits of 9mm just to centre that. Sit better on there, can't we? And then with that in the centre, it looks much happier all the way around. So we can do that and nail it down. Now what I'm going to do, this is just going to be fixed with a couple of pins to begin with, and then we'll fix some screws in there. But before we do anything, you get plenty of glue. I'm using an 18 gauge Maestri electric pin gun to hold the panels in place before carefully attaching them to the rails with 3.5 by 30mm screws, driving the screws in slowly towards the end to help avoid splitting the beading. Again, this is slightly tedious work, but worth doing well.